Designing Microsoft Azure Infrastructure Solutions AZ-305 exam. Updated questions are the best material for you to study all the related Microsoft AZ-305 exam topics. Share some updated Microsoft AZ-305 exam questions here. 1. You plan to migrate App 1 to Azure. You need to recommend a network connectivity solution for the Azure storage account that will host the App 1 data. The solution must meet the security and compliance requirements. What should you include in the recommendation? A private endpoint. B. A service endpoint that has a service endpoint policy. C. Azure public peering for an ExpressRoute circuit. D. Microsoft peering for an ExpressRoute circuit. 2. You plan to migrate App 1 to Azure. The solution must meet the authentication and authorization requirements. Which type of endpoint should App 1 use to obtain an access token? A. Azure Instance Metadata Service (IMDS). B. Azure AD. C. Azure Service Management. D. Microsoft Identity Platform. 3. You migrate App 1 to Azure. You need to ensure that the data storage for App 1 meets the security and compliance requirement. What should you do? A. Create an access policy for the blob. B. Modify the access level of the blob service. C. Implement Azure Resource Locks. D. Create Azure RBAC assignments. 4. You need to recommend a data storage strategy for Web App 1. What should you include in the recommendation? A. An Azure SQL database elastic pool. B. A vCore-based Azure SQL database. C. An Azure virtual machine that runs SQL Server. D. A fixed-size DTU Azure SQL database. 5. You need to recommend a solution to meet the database retention requirement. What should you recommend? A. Configure a long-term retention policy for the database. B. Configure Azure Site Recovery. C. Configure geo-replication of the database. D. Use automatic Azure SQL database backups. 6. You need to recommend a notification solution for the IT support distribution group. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Network Watcher. B. An action group. C. A SendGrid account with advanced reporting. D. Azure AD Connect Health. 7. What should you include in the identity management strategy to support the planned changes? A. Move all the domain controllers from corp.fabricam.com to virtual networks in Azure. B. Deploy domain controllers for corp.fabricam.com to virtual networks in Azure. C. Deploy a new Azure AD tenant for the authentication of new R&D projects. D. Deploy domain controllers for the rd.fabricam.com forest to virtual networks in Azure. 8. You need to recommend a strategy for the web tier of Web App 1. The solution must minimize. What should you recommend? A. Create a runbook that resizes virtual machines automatically to a smaller size outside of business hours. B. Configure the scale-up settings for a web app. C. Deploy a virtual machine scale set that scales out on a 75% CPU threshold. D. Configure the scale-out settings for a web app. 9. You need to recommend an app service architecture that meets the requirements for Apple. The solution must minimize costs. What should few recommend? A. One App Service Environment, ASE, per availability zone. B. One App Service Plan per availability zone. C. One App Service Plan per region. D. One App Service Environment, ASE, per region. 10. You need to recommend a solution that meets the data requirements for App 1. What should you recommend deploying to each availability zone that contains an instance of App 1? A. An Azure Cosmos DB that uses multi-region rights. B. An Azure Storage Account that uses GeoZone Redundant Storage, GZRS. C. An Azure Data Lake Store that uses GeoZone Redundant Storage, GZRS. D. An Azure SQL database that uses active geo-replication.